built as commentary around allegations and courtroom implications, not as a statement of adjudicated fact. Stop everything, because the most explosive part of the Tupac murder case might not be the evidence already shown in court. The most explosive part might be the testimony still waiting in the hallway. The courtroom is suddenly sitting on a trapdoor, and Keefe D may be standing on the weakest plank. If Keefe D says nothing, Keefe D looks buried by old words. If Keefe D tries to talk, Keefe D may open a door that leads straight past Las Vegas, past old gang politics, and right into the question that has haunted hip-hop for decades. Was Diddy closer to the center of Tupac's murder than the public was ever supposed to prove? That question just got oxygen again because the prosecution rested. The defense is loading up, and Suge Knight dropped a statement so reckless that even Harvey on TMZ sounded stunned. Suge Knight did not just say Keefe D tried to reach out. Suge Knight said Keefe D allegedly tried more than once to buy a news story. Not a small favor, not a misunderstanding, a $500,000 to $1 million kind of story. The alleged request was simple. Say Keefe D was not in the car. That detail matters because innocent people do not usually spend fortune-level money trying to erase a seed assignment from a murder narrative. People do that when placement becomes poison. Now pause there, because the average recap stops at the headline and runs straight to outrage. The real pressure point sits underneath the headline. Suge Knight has been locked up for years. Any serious outreach to Suge Knight does not float through thin air. Jail visits leave records. Lawyers leave trails. Calls can leave recordings. Messages do not teleport into correctional facilities like ghost smoke. So if Suge Knight told the truth about those alleged offers, the story is not only that Keefe D wanted distance from the car. The story becomes this. Somebody believed moving Suge Knight mattered enough to risk creating a fresh record while a legendary murder case was already under a microscope. That is where the whole picture gets darker. Because once money allegedly starts moving for silence, the audience has to ask a brutal question. Who benefits enough to fund silence years after Tupac's death? Years after documentaries, interviews, confessions, retractions, and street mythology hardened into public memory. Keefe D alone is the simplest answer, but simple answers rarely survive cases like this. Not when names, loyalties, egos, business ties, and old debts are stacked on top of one another like a tower built to collapse. Suge Knight pushed the story even further by claiming law enforcement involvement around the edges. Not a vague rumor. Not some soft, maybe somebody looked the other way. Suge Knight said crooked cops and off-duty or connected police moved around the orbit of the case. That claim lit up the room for one reason. Once police-adjacent protection enters the frame, the murder stops looking like a random retaliation story and starts looking like a coordinated environment, a setting where muscle, access, and cleanup all become possible at the same time. And that is where Diddy's shadow gets dragged back into the conversation, whether anybody likes that or not. For years, the public has heard variations of the same allegation. Keefe D once talked as if Diddy offered money tied to Tupac's death. Later, Keefe D tried to walk that back. The retreat came after the words were already out in the world, after cameras rolled, after interviews became evidence instead of entertainment. That reversal never erased the original blast. That reversal only changed the stakes. Because a statement like that is not ordinary gossip. A statement like that becomes a legal landmine once prosecutors decide recorded interviews belong in a courtroom instead of a YouTube rabbit hole. Here is the angle nobody should ignore. The defense might accidentally do more damage to Diddy than the prosecution has done so far. The prosecution already played old interviews. The prosecution already planted the idea that Keefe D talked too much when Keefe D felt safe. But the defense has a different burden. The defense cannot simply say the state failed. The defense has to create doubt with an alternate story strong enough to feel real. That means names. That means timelines. That means motive. That means another route for the bullets and another author for the plan. And if the defense starts naming the someone else behind the act, the defense could wind up sketching a cleaner map toward Diddy than the state was ready to draw in open court. That possibility changes everything. Because an alternate perpetrator strategy is not just a shield. In a case like this, an alternate perpetrator strategy can turn into a spotlight. The second Keefe D side suggests a bigger architect. Every old allegation gets rehydrated. Every old rumor gets measured against testimony. Every strange business tie starts looking less like gossip and more like connective tissue. Suddenly the question is no longer whether Keefe D ever bragged recklessly. The question becomes whether Keefe D bragged because parts of the story were true, and whether the parts Keefe D later denied were the parts most dangerous to living, powerful people. Look at the pattern. Keefe D allegedly spoke when public consequences felt far away. Keefe D allegedly told stories on platforms built for clout, mythology, and chest beating. Then reality arrived. Charges arrived. Court arrived. Evidence arrived. Public playback arrived. That is the moment when street legend collides with legal gravity. And once that collision happened, Keefe D needed a new identity. Not the loud storyteller. Not the old neighborhood narrator. Keefe D suddenly needed to become misunderstood, misquoted, exaggerated, maybe even framed by Keefe D's own mouth. That switch is not a coincidence. That switch is survival. But survival creates contradictions. If Keefe D was lying before, why lie in a way that points toward a name as radioactive as Diddy? If Keefe D was telling the truth before, why retreat unless retreat protects something larger than embarrassment? Pride alone does not explain that kind of reversal. Fear does. Exposure does. Pressure does. The possibility of blowing up more than one life does. The possibility of dragging business empires, celebrity mythology, and law enforcement proximity back into a murder story does. Then there is the money question, and the money question keeps getting uglier the longer the audience sits with it. According to the theory repeated in the news ecosystem for years, Diddy supposedly floated $1 million promise tied to Tupac and Suge Knight. Whether that allegation can ever be proven cleanly is one issue. But within the story now circling court, Suge Knight says Keefe D later tried to float huge money again to reshape the narrative. So the audience is left staring at a pattern that sounds disturbingly familiar. Major money attached not to art, not to loyalty, not to healing, but to silence, distance, and narrative control. Narrative control matters here more than almost anything, because this case has never lived only in legal files. This case lives in interviews, documentaries, rap history, conspiracy boards, memoir fragments, old street politics, and the emotional memory of a generation that still sees Tupac as unfinished prophecy. Whoever controls the story controls the temperature. Whoever controls the temperature controls pressure. And whoever controls pressure buys time. That is why so many people are obsessed with what Keefe D said, unsaid, resaid, and withdrew. The words matter because the words keep showing where the fire is hottest. Now bring in the timing around Diddy's wider legal chaos, because that timing refuses to be ignored. Diddy's name is already floating through lawsuits, allegations, former associate statements, and claims about security structures built from off-duty or connected police personnel. On its own, that background does not prove involvement in Tupac's murder. But background changes how new claims land. A pristine public image can smother accusations. A crumbling public image does the opposite. Once a giant figure starts looking vulnerable everywhere else, old stories return with fresh teeth. The public starts revisiting details once dismissed as too wild, too messy, or too dangerous to touch. That is why the courtroom week ahead matters so much. The prosecution resting early does not mean the case is weak. The prosecution resting early may mean the prosecution believes the tape trail already did enough to wound credibility and set the floor. The defense, meanwhile, now has to take that floor and build a house on it without the house collapsing. And the materials available to Keefe D's defense are volatile. Any explanation that turns Keefe D into a bystander has to explain why Keefe D sounded like an insider for so long. Any explanation that turns Keefe D into a liar has to explain why the lies kept circling the same dangerous center. That dangerous center is not merely who pulled a trigger or who sat in a car. The dangerous center is authorship. Who wanted Tupac gone badly enough to convert anger into logistics? Who had motive strong enough to turn beef into budget? Who had relationships broad enough to connect street-level action with celebrity-level distance? That is the missing bridge in every version of this case, and every time the public thinks the bridge is about to appear, somebody walks backward, somebody retracts, somebody clams up, or somebody dies. Suge Knight's comments matter because Suge Knight did not frame Keefe D as some isolated mastermind sitting alone with unlimited leverage. Suge Knight framed a group environment, a web, a murky cluster where multiple hands stirred the same water. That claim fits the emotional logic of the case better than the lone villain version ever did. Tupac's death never felt small. Tupac's death felt like the climax of too many tensions at once. East Coast versus West Coast, money versus loyalty, celebrity versus street code, image versus reality, and power versus consequence. A murder born from all of that almost demands a network instead of a single angry moment. And then there is one more detail that keeps scratching at the back of the story. If the defense says Keefe D did not do it, the defense has to explain who did. Not maybe. Not eventually. In practical terms, the defense has to hand the jury a believable substitute reality. That substitute reality could become the most revealing document of the entire trial. Because once the defense starts filling in blanks, prosecutors, media, civil litigants, and federal investigators can compare every claim against evidence already sitting off stage. A failed defense argument can still become a roadmap for another case. That is the trapdoor. Keefe D may try to escape one box and fall through the floor into another. Clear Keefe D from the driver's seat circle, and another circle tightens somewhere else. Shift the lens from Keefe D, and the lens lands on financing, intermediaries, messengers, and motive brokers. Push blame toward a hidden organizer, and suddenly the world starts asking which famous name had old motive, alleged money, and enough distance to hide behind layers of deniability. That question is the reason Diddy should not be sleeping easy, even without a new charge filed tomorrow morning. Plenty of people will say all of this is too speculative. Fair. Speculation becomes garbage when speculation floats without anchors. But this conversation has anchors. One anchor is Keefe D's own public history of talking. Another anchor is Suge Knight's allegation about payoff attempts. Another anchor is the legal reality that recorded interviews are not harmless once entered as evidence. Another anchor is the defense's coming need to explain away years of dangerous statements. Those anchors do not prove every conclusion. Those anchors do make the next phase impossible to dismiss as random internet smoke. And remember something else. High-profile cases often crack, not from the main accusation, but from secondary pressure. A person lies to protect status. Another person talks to protect freedom. Another person flips a detail to protect family. Another person suddenly remembers a meeting because old loyalties expired. The final truth often arrives through self-interest, not nobility. In a case tangled with celebrity, prison leverage, gang history, and decaying reputations, self-interest is everywhere. That means the trial is not only about evidence already shown. The trial is about pressure redistribution. Once pressure moves, weak links start making noise. That is why Suge Knight's interview felt so dangerous. Suge Knight did not merely revive an old feud narrative. Suge Knight moved the pressure. Suge Knight told the public to stop looking at the case as a sealed museum exhibit and start looking at the case like a live wire. Because if Keefe D was shopping for revised testimony, then somebody was still worried. Still worried means still exposed. Still exposed means the story never really closed. Still open means the next witness may matter more than the last decade of documentaries combined. Now imagine the defense calling witnesses meant to rescue Keefe D. Imagine one witness saying Keefe D was not physically central. Imagine another witness implying the real command came from elsewhere. Imagine another witness describing relationships that put street actors in contact with celebrity-adjacent money, lawyers, or fixers. Even if those witnesses are attacked, even if jurors reject half the story, the public record expands. A new name placed under oath hits differently than a name tossed around on old internet clips. Under oath insinuation can become tomorrow's subpoena fuel. That is the unique danger hovering over Diddy. Not immediate conviction. Not instant arrest. Exposure by accumulation. Diddy's risk is that one proceeding meant to determine Keefe D's fate could assemble enough narrative structure to justify broader scrutiny of Diddy's past. In other words, Keefe D's defense could function like accidental discovery. Every attempt to redirect guilt might also redirect investigative interest. Every effort to loosen one knot might reveal a larger rope. And once the public sees that rope, public memory does the rest. Old claims about money offers. Old whispers about security circles. Old statements by people who once sounded too reckless to believe. Old notes allegedly kept by insiders around bad boy logistics. Old travel details. Old whispered theories about who really benefited when Tupac disappeared and fear spread across an industry. Most of that material lives in fragments. Trials have a way of forcing fragments into shape. That is why this moment feels different from ordinary gossip churn. Gossip chases sensation. Court changes consequence. A rumor repeated on a stream can die in 48 hours. A theory echoed through testimony can survive for years, especially if other cases, other lawsuits, or other agencies start pulling on the same thread. The courtroom does not need to solve the entire Tupac mystery to become a turning point. The courtroom only needs to create a durable, testable trail toward the next pressure point. And the next pressure point might be motive translated into money. That is the core of the whole thing. Anger explains emotion. Money explains movement. Without money, murder theories often stay in the realm of rage. With money, murder theories become operational. Vehicles appear. Access appears. Silence appears. Distance appears. If the defense opens the door to a finance plot, even by implication, the conversation around Diddy gets heavier overnight. Another reason this story is so combustible is that Tupac is not just another victim in public memory. Tupac represents interrupted force. Tupac represents a finished anger. Attach Diddy's name to that emotional current, and the story becomes bigger than legal analysis. The story becomes a referendum on an era, on an industry, and on how much hidden violence celebrity power can keep buried before the burial ground cracks open. Keefe D knows that. Suge Knight knows that. Diddy definitely knows that. Every lawyer near the case knows that. That is why language around this trial has been so slippery. Nobody wants to be the person who says too much too clearly unless a tactical benefit outweighs the risk. But trials distort tactics. Sometimes the move that saves today destroys tomorrow. Sometimes the statement that narrows one charge widens 10 other questions. Sometimes a defendant survives one narrative only by dragging a more famous name closer to the fire. That is exactly why the coming testimony could be the real headline, not the prosecution's closing of its own case. The state already tossed a match. The defense may pour gasoline while claiming to put flames out. If Keefe D's side argues that somebody else orchestrated the killing, the public is going to demand a name, not an invisible phantom, not a blurry other people, a name. And once the demand for a name becomes unavoidable, Diddy's old proximity to the mythology of this case will return to center stage, whether Diddy wants silence, denial, or distance. Even the structure of the current chatter points in the same direction. Notice how every pathway keeps bending back toward coordination. Suge Knight talks about alleged payoff attempts. Keefe D's old statements talk about money offers. Analysts talk about missing evidence and possible records. Insiders talk about vehicles, notes, and long memory business logistics. None of those strands alone equal proof. Together, those strands create a shape. Not random chaos, but controlled chaos. The kind of chaos powerful people prefer because confusion protects everybody until one frightened participant miscalculates. And Keefe D may have miscalculated years ago. Talking can feel smart when nobody expects the tape to come back inside a courtroom. Retraction can feel smart when panic replaces swagger. But timing exposes motive. The timing of the retreat matters almost as much as the original statement. People rarely sprint backward unless the cliff edge suddenly becomes visible. Charges made the cliff visible. Public replay made the cliff visible. The possibility that defense testimony could line up with parts of Keefe D's old narrative makes the cliff terrifying. So here is the bottom line nobody should miss. The Tupac case may be entering the phase where protecting Keefe D becomes inseparable from explaining Diddy. Not convicting Diddy. Not even formally accusing Diddy in a new filing tomorrow. Explaining Diddy. Explaining why Diddy's name keeps resurfacing whenever money, motive, and orchestration collide inside the same conversation. Explaining why a retracted allegation still refuses to die. Explaining why powerful people always seem one witness away from major trouble, yet somehow stay just outside the tape. That is why the next few courtroom days matter more than the last few years of recycled headlines. This is no longer just about whether prosecutors proved enough from the past. This is about whether the defense can tell a cleaner story than the story already sitting in the public bloodstream. And cleaner may be impossible, because the only way to clean Keefe D may be to dirty the room around Keefe D even more. Now the case enters the dangerous zone. The next witness may not only defend Keefe D. The next witness may explain why Diddy's name keeps surviving every cleanup attempt. If that happens, this trial stops being a recap of history and starts becoming the document that rewrites history in real time.